Hey, for all that talk about Greenland the last few days, did anyone else forget that there is still a war going on over in Ukraine? Well, Zelensky was in Davos with everyone else to remind them that, yeah, actually there is. It was basically Zelensky unleashed, as he offered his blunt personal assessment for how to deal with the Russia problem. And the crazy thing is that normally you do not expect Zelensky and Trump to agree on much, but there is some important convergence in their strategic vision here. Let's rewind for a minute. The Greenland saga began when Trump started pushing the idea that Russia and China are threatening the island. This constitutes an emergency, and only the United States has the ability to stop them. Zelensky will disagree on a key strategic point here in a moment, but we should first have a quick reality check about the situation as it stands now. Emphasis on as it stands now. Bear in mind that I am just going off of open source intelligence information on this. I would love it if the United States gave a briefing on the exact nature of the problem, but we do not live in my fantasy world, now do we? As far as we can tell, there is basically no imminent or short-term threat there. China is not proximate at all, and cares much more about what is happening along the Taiwan Strait. Russia, in contrast, is proximate and sees itself in an existential war against the West, so at least that is a start. But there are other geographic and political realities that cause problems here. Step 1 of any hostile Greenland takeover would be to actually land an occupation force on the island. This starts to run into an immediate problem, because Russia's Northern Fleet had only a handful of landing ships before the invasion of Ukraine began. Moreover, the Kremlin transferred about half of them to the Black Sea, where they remain paralyzed by the combination of a closed Bosporus Strait and Ukrainian sea drones. More on the latter in a minute. Now, the lockdown there opens the possibility that Russia's other fleets could transfer their landing ships to the Northern Fleet, given that they cannot contribute to the war in Ukraine. This has not happened, and in some ways, the Western coalition would be better off letting it happen. The mess that it would create would likely overload the Kremlin's ability to fight in Ukraine, and thus there are fringe benefits here. The next question is where the Russian troops would go. Bedufik's space base is clear around the other side of Greenland. It is the most strategically important thing on the island, but how you would hold it when the United States could just institute a blockade here is unclear. Nuuk, the capital with a population of 20,000, is just west of the southern tip of Greenland. But you would still have to contend with a blockade between Greenland and Iceland, between Iceland and the United Kingdom, or an extended one along the Labrador Sea. Eastern Greenland is sparsely populated, but would force NATO to institute a localized blockade, and there are at least enough people to hold hostage to try to deter a counter-invasion. You could try to supplement the landing party with resupply drops from IL-76 aircraft, assuming that you pick a target that has an airfield nearby, but it would be difficult to pair them with fighter escorts given the distances involved. To be clear, the distance is not as far as it seems if you look at a Mercator projection, but even flying over the North Pole, it is a long way to go. Meanwhile, NATO fighters have a much easier time coming in from Canada, or the Atlantic aircraft carrier known as the ICG Iceland. And after you have done all of that, what benefit did you gain? I guess you occupy the town and claim that part of Greenland is now Russia, just as what has happened in Ukraine. But as of now, the island is still covered in ice, you cannot extract the mineral wealth, and the sea lanes are not ready to be put into heavy use. Now, along those lines, there are actual security concerns involving commercial activity that does run through the region. You will be shocked to hear this, but Russia uses commercial ships to run espionage and sabotage operations. This is the best argument on the need for the development of defense infrastructure today, and the lack of proper surveillance in the region was one of the concerns that the Supreme Allied Commander Europe expressed to member states. But it is worth remembering that this, as of now, is not a military threat. The only real military concern for Greenland right now is observing ballistic missiles flying overhead aimed at Canada or the United States, which was the other part of the briefing to the Allies. But that is easily handled by simply building more radars. In contrast, the other military activities that Russia could execute in the region are too much trouble to be worthwhile given the current value of Greenland, never mind the bandwidth problems with Ukraine. Now, that might seem like an argument that the entirety of the Greenland gaslighting was purposeless, but hold on one second. Here is another headline coming out of Davos. Zelensky, deploying 40 troops to defend Greenland sends a signal to Putin. This was a fun one to watch on social media, because you could tell who actually read the article and who just looked at the headline and let their prior beliefs dictate the rest of the story. Wow, incredible job by Ukraine to find the troops to spare to be a part of this critical European effort. Nope, and that would probably need some type of treaty first to govern how Ukrainian troops interoperate with the remaining European contingent. Nice. Zelensky appreciates how Europe is stepping up to handle the phantom problems that the Trump administration touts. Nope, not that either. Actually, the tone of Zelensky's speech is exactly the opposite. He began the speech by referencing Groundhog Day, perhaps the greatest film about a Pittsburgh weatherman of all time. His point was that the speech that he was about to give was the same speech that he gave last year, and indeed is the same speech he keeps on giving, because no one is doing anything differently. He is basically Phil Connors waking up every morning, and it is Groundhog Day all over again. And it is Groundhog Day all over again. And it is Groundhog Day all over again. I am just going to quote Zelensky, because I could not have written it better. Europe loves to discuss the future, but avoids taking action today. Action that defines what kind of future we will have. That is the problem. If you send 30 or 40 soldiers to Greenland, what is that for? What message does it send? What's the message to Putin? To China? And even more importantly, what message does it send to Denmark? You either declare that European bases will protect the region from Russia and China, or you risk not being taken seriously, because 30 or 40 soldiers will not protect anything. This may sound surprising, especially for the contingency who believe that the whole Greenland debacle was part of some grand conspiracy between Putin and Trump to distract Europe from defending Ukraine. But no. Zelensky is speaking to a problematic mindset that causes issues for both him and European security elsewhere. He is not alone with that assessment. It matches the frustrations coming from the Pentagon for decades. It matches the frustrations that European hawks have had for an equal amount of time. And yet there remains a ton of resistance in Europe to change. Many of these voices also extol the virtues of Zelensky the war hero. One wonders whether this new messaging will change their minds. It is not just a commitment to spending 5% of GDP on defense. It is a commitment to being assertive in security matters, and, just as importantly, having a reputation for being assertive in security matters. That applies just as much to a peacekeeping force in Ukraine as it does to securing the Arctic. Further, Zelensky is more than happy to contribute. If Russian warships are sailing freely around Greenland, Ukraine can help. We have the expertise and weapons to ensure that not one of those ships remains. They can sink near Greenland just as they do near Crimea. No problem. We have the tools and people. If we were asked, and if Ukraine were in NATO, but we are not, we would solve this problem with the Russian ships. Zelensky was not so subtly referencing the many one-way naval drones it has used on the Black Sea, and let's not forget that one-off near Senegal. Absent admitting Ukraine to NATO and just working with the country anyway, the situation here is a bit different because Ukraine would need a location to work from, such as Iceland. Previously, Ukraine likely found some place to secretly set up operations along Africa. Russia did not respond in the area because it is plausible that the corresponding country truly had no idea what was going on. Once there are sustained operations coming from Iceland, though, there is no plausible deniability. Russia will treat them as attacks from NATO itself, and then we run into escalation concerns just as we would if NATO were directly doing the bombing. But the point still stands. It is not just land-based drone tactics that NATO needs to learn about from Ukraine. Ukraine also knows something about the sea. And despite our earlier conversation about the lack of imminent threats to Greenland, this still matters, because the West cannot solve security problems as they happen. As soon as you lose the initiative, the problems just get worse. It is the same sort of shift in mindset that the West needs to move away from just-in-time weapons manufacturing to thinking about how to stockpile equipment. And even when the problems do arise, Europe does not have a great track record on adjusting course quickly. Just ask Zelensky how he feels about European contributions to the war effort, or more specifically for the issues at hand today. Yes, he prefers weapons aid to no weapons aid, but he would really like a robust European peacekeeping force. Shifting locations. There will be a day in the not-too-distant future when Greenland looks valuable enough to take a gamble on. Maybe Russia begins influence operations in Greenland to try turning the population against Denmark, leading to a sovereignty crisis of a different form. Then one day, Russian troops show up to protect the population from Western aggression, because we have never seen that one before, right? Maybe Russia tries something more direct. Those landing ships begin to accumulate, and so one day they group up and head to shore. The US Navy is supposed to deter that, because up pops a blockade, and all of those Russian soldiers freeze to death. But that presupposes that the US Navy is not distracted elsewhere, because there is nothing in the next 10 years that can involve the entire US Navy getting involved in a civilizational war, right? As Zelensky says, what would stop Russia from trying this is the belief that Europe will step in and defend the island. In that light, what sort of signal does dispatching 30 or 40 soldiers to Greenland send? The latter half of the mantra, "Don't listen to what leaders say, watch what they do," highlights the idea that talk is cheap, but actions are expensive. At least certain actions, anyway. And those costs are what convey credibility. Sending 30 or 40 soldiers is not much of a cost, and it conveys a corresponding amount of credibility. Maybe Europe would actually crack down with a strong intervention when push comes to shove. But that is not the message being sent, and it is not the lesson being learned in the Kremlin. It is much better to convince the Kremlin to not even try than to deal with the aftermath. Zelensky is telling Europe that the continent is headed toward the latter situation. If there is any bright spot for the West, it is that this whole conversation may be superfluous. We do not know the details of the Davos deal regarding Greenland. It is perfectly plausible to think that Trump was satisfied with the framework because it addressed the issue, and Zelensky did not realize that it was the final iteration of his Groundhog Day saga. This would make sense as Denmark insists that no sovereignty concessions on Greenland were made. Rutte says that the subject did not even come up in negotiations, and not even Trump is touting it despite being the type of thing that he would like to scream from the rooftops. But we will have to wait for the details to come out before we know for sure. Meanwhile, you do not have to wait for these two excellent books about the current war. They have digital editions that you can get instantly. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.